You know how sometimes there's that one person who just shows up at exactly the right moment in history and somehow becomes the blueprint for everything that comes after? That's basically George Washington. And the wild thing is, he didn't even really want the job, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So picture this. It's the 1700s and America isn't even America yet. It's just a bunch of colonies hanging out on the edge of a continent, dealing with British rule and trying to figure out if they're cool with that or not. Spoiler alert, they were not cool with that. And right in the middle of all this tension and uncertainty, you've got this tall Virginia guy who's about to become the most important figure in American history. No pressure or anything. Washington was born in 1732 in Virginia, which at the time was basically just farmland and tobacco fields as far as the eye could see. His family wasn't crazy rich, but they weren't struggling either. They were what you'd call prosperous, which in colonial terms meant they had land and slaves and were doing all right for themselves. His dad died when George was pretty young, like 11 years old, and that kind of changed everything for him. Suddenly, he's not getting the fancy education his older brothers got. He's learning surveying instead, which honestly probably helped him more in the long run than Latin ever would have. The thing about young Washington is that he was ambitious as hell. He wanted to be somebody. He wanted respect and status and all those things that drive people to do remarkable things, and he worked for it. By the time he was a teenager, he was out there surveying land in the wilderness, sleeping under the stars, dealing with difficult terrain and even more difficult people. It was rough work, but it taught him discipline and gave him this incredible knowledge of the American landscape that would come in handy later when he was, fighting a war across that same landscape. Then he got into the military, and this is where things start getting interesting. He joined the Virginia militia and got sent on various missions during the French and Indian War. And here's the thing about Washington's early military career. It was kind of a disaster. He made mistakes. He lost battles. There was this whole incident at Fort Necessity where his forces got absolutely wrecked and he had to surrender. Not exactly the glorious start you'd expect from someone who'd later lead an army to victory against the British Empire. But here's what mattered. He learned from it. Every failure taught him something. Every setback made him better. And people noticed that he was brave. Like, stupidly brave. Horses were shot out from under him, bullets tore through his coat, and he just kept going. By the time the American Revolution rolled around, Washington had been living the life of a Virginia gentleman for years. He'd married Martha Custis, this wealthy widow, and suddenly he's managing this massive estate at Mount Vernon. He's got hundreds of slaves working his land. He's playing the role of the country squire, attending fancy parties, serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He could have just stayed comfortable. But then the whole thing with Britain started heating up. The taxes, the regulations, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, all of it was pushing the colonies toward rebellion. And Washington, even though he had plenty to lose, was right there with the Patriots. He showed up to the Continental Congress in his old military uniform, which was basically his way of saying, "I'm ready to fight," without actually saying it. And when they needed someone to lead the Continental Army, everyone looked at him. Partly because he had military experience, partly because he was from Virginia and they needed someone from the South to balance things out politically, but mostly because he just had this presence about him. He looked like a leader, he acted like a leader, so they made him the leader. Now, leading the Continental Army was not some glamorous gig. This wasn't a professional military force. This was a ragtag collection of farmers and merchants and kids who barely knew which end of a musket to point at the enemy. They didn't have proper uniforms, they didn't have enough weapons, they definitely didn't have enough food, and they kept running away when things got tough because, they had farms to get back to. Washington had to hold this thing together through sheer force of will. The early days of the war were rough, really rough. Washington lost more battles than he won. New York was a disaster. His army got pushed around Long Island, Manhattan, through New Jersey. There were moments when it looked like the whole revolution was going to collapse before it really got started. But Washington had this ability to keep things going even when everything looked hopeless. That famous crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night in 1776, that was Washington being like, okay, we're getting absolutely demolished here, but if we don't do something dramatic right now, this is over. So they got in boats in the middle of a freezing winter night, crossed an ice-filled river, and attacked Trenton when the Hessian soldiers there were still hungover from Christmas. It worked. It gave everyone hope that maybe, just maybe, they could actually win this thing. The winter at Valley Forge is the stuff of legend, and for good reason. Imagine trying to keep an army together when they're literally freezing and starving to death. There were soldiers without shoes leaving bloody footprints in the snow. There was disease everywhere. People were deserting left and right. Congress wasn't sending supplies or money. And Washington is out there with them, dealing with the same conditions, refusing to give up. He wrote letter after letter to Congress basically begging them to support the army, and when that didn't work fast enough, he figured out other ways to keep things going. He learned to be not just a general but a politician, a diplomat, a logistics expert, everything at once. What made Washington special as a military leader wasn't that he was some tactical genius. He wasn't Napoleon coming up with brilliant strategies that historians would study for centuries. What made him special was his strategic vision and his incredible persistence. He understood that he didn't need to destroy the British army. He just needed to keep his army alive and keep fighting long enough that the British would get tired and give up. It was a war of attrition, and he was willing to play the long game even when everyone around him was losing faith. And then there was his relationship with his officers and soldiers. He had this ability to inspire loyalty that was kind of remarkable. Sure, there were plots against him and people who thought they could do better, but overall, his army stuck with him through impossible conditions. Part of it was that he shared their hardships. He wasn't sitting in some comfortable headquarters while they suffered. He was out there with them, and part of it was just his character. He had this dignity and integrity that people responded to. When he could have used his position for personal gain, he didn't. When he could have been a tyrant, he wasn't. He led by example. The alliance with France changed everything, obviously. Suddenly, the Americans had actual military support, a real navy, experienced officers, money, and supplies. Yorktown in 1781 was where it all came together. Washington and the French forces trapped the British army under Cornwallis on this peninsula in Virginia, and after a siege, they surrendered. It was over. America had actually won. The underdog colonies had defeated the most powerful empire in the world. And Washington was the hero of the whole thing. Now here's where Washington could have gone full dictator. He had a loyal army. He had popular support. The government under the Articles of Confederation was weak and chaotic. There were literally people suggesting he should become king. Some of his officers wanted him to march on Congress and take power by force because they weren't getting paid. And what did Washington do? He told them no. He gave this speech to his officers that made grown men cry, and then he went to Congress and resigned his commission. He just gave up power and went home. That was basically unheard of at the time. Military leaders didn't just voluntarily give up power. They seized it. But Washington was like, nah, I'm good. I'm going back to Mount Vernon to farm. Except he couldn't really retire because the country was kind of falling apart. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. States were fighting with each other. There was no real federal power. The economy was a mess, and people were starting to worry that maybe this whole independence thing was a mistake. So they called another convention to try to fix things, and of course they wanted Washington there. He didn't really want to go. He was tired. He wanted to actually retire. But he went anyway because he cared about the country more than his own comfort. The Constitutional Convention in 1787 was this wild gathering of some of the smartest people in America trying to figure out how to create a government that wouldn't fall apart or become tyrannical. Washington was elected president of the convention, which mostly meant he sat there looking dignified while other people argued. But his presence mattered. It gave the whole thing legitimacy. People trusted that if Washington was involved, it was probably going to be okay. And when they created this new position called the presidency with enormous powers, everyone was thinking, well, Washington will be the first one, so we can trust that these powers won't be abused. They literally designed the job with him in mind. So then they had to actually elect a president under this new constitution, and surprise, surprise, everyone voted for Washington. Unanimously. He's still the only president ever elected unanimously. He really didn't want the job. He was happy at Mount Vernon. But once again, duty called, and Washington answered. In 1789, he traveled to New York City, which was the temporary capital, to take the oath of office and become the first president of the United States. Think about how insane that responsibility is for a second. There's no precedent for any of this. Everything he does is setting the standard for every president that comes after. How formal should the president be? How much power should he use? How should he interact with Congress? With foreign governments? With regular citizens? There's no instruction manual. Washington is literally making it up as he goes along, knowing that whatever he does will become the template. He took it seriously. Maybe too seriously. He was so worried about doing the wrong thing that he sometimes seemed stiff and formal. He held these reception events called levees where people could come meet the president, but he was all business, standing there in formal clothes, not really chatting with people. Some folks thought he was acting too much like a king. Others thought he wasn't being dignified enough. He couldn't win. But what he was really trying to do was find this balance between being accessible and maintaining the dignity and respect of the office. He knew that if the presidency seemed weak or silly, the whole government could collapse. His cabinet was this collection of brilliant but argumentative people. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and these two could not stand each other. They had completely different visions for America. Hamilton wanted a strong federal government, a national bank, manufacturing, ties with Britain. Jefferson wanted limited federal power, an agriculture-based economy, strong state governments, ties with France. And they would argue about this constantly. Washington was stuck in the middle trying to get them to work together, which must have been exhausting. But having different viewpoints actually helped him make better decisions. He'd listen to both sides, think it through, and then make a call. The whole political parties thing happened on his watch, and he hated it. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans started forming around Hamilton and Jefferson, and Washington was like, guys, please don't do this. Political parties are going to tear the country apart. He was worried that people would become more loyal to their party than to the country, and honestly, looking at modern politics, he might have had a point. But he couldn't stop it. It was happening whether he liked it or not. Foreign policy was a nightmare. The French Revolution happened, and suddenly America's ally France is beheading people and getting into wars with Britain and other European powers. Some Americans wanted to support France because they'd helped us in our revolution. Others wanted to stay neutral or even side with Britain because of trade relationships. Washington decided on neutrality, which made everybody mad at him. Jefferson and his supporters thought we were abandoning our ally. Hamilton and his crew thought we should be closer to Britain. Washington just wanted to keep America out of European wars that weren't our problem. He issued the Neutrality Proclamation, and while people complained, it was probably the right call. The country was too young and weak to get involved in massive European conflicts. Then there was the Whiskey Rebellion, which sounds kind of funny, but was actually a serious test of federal authority. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were mad about a tax on whiskey that Hamilton had pushed through, and they started refusing to pay it and attacking tax collectors. Washington had to decide, does the federal government actually have the power to enforce its laws or not? He called up the militia, personally led them part of the way to Pennsylvania, and the rebellion collapsed without much violence. It proved that the federal government could actually enforce its authority when necessary, not with tyranny, but with the rule of law. After 4 years, Washington wanted to retire. Again. He'd done his duty, set up the government, got things running, but everyone begged him to do a second term. The country wasn't stable enough yet. Political divisions were getting worse. They needed him to stick around. So he agreed to another 4 years, even though he really didn't want to. That second term was harder than the first. The political fighting got worse. People started attacking him in newspapers, calling him a tyrant, saying he was senile, all kinds of nasty stuff. This was new for Washington, who'd spent most of his life being admired and respected. Having people publicly hate on him was rough. By the end of the second term, he was done, completely finished. He was in his mid-60s, which was old for that time. He was tired. His health wasn't great. And he'd done what he set out to do. He'd established the presidency, proved the Constitution could work, kept the country together through its most vulnerable early years. In 1796, he announced he wouldn't run for a third term. He could have easily won again, but he said no. And in doing so, he established this tradition that presidents should only serve 2 terms. That tradition held until FDR, and then they made it a constitutional amendment after that. But it started with Washington voluntarily walking away from power for the second time in his life. His farewell address is this incredible document that he published in the newspapers. He warned against political parties. He warned against permanent foreign alliances. He urged national unity. He basically laid out his vision for how America should conduct itself, and people treated it like scripture for generations. Even now, members of Congress read it aloud every year. Some of his warnings seem almost prophetic when you look at modern politics. So he finally got to retire for real. He went back to Mount Vernon, managed his farms, dealt with the endless stream of visitors who wanted to meet the great George Washington. He had less than 3 years of retirement before he died in December 1799. He got sick, probably from an infection, and the medical treatments of the time, which involved bleeding patients, probably made it worse. He died at home, surrounded by family, at the age of 67. The whole country mourned. People wore black armbands for months. There were memorial services everywhere. Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning in France. Britain's navy lowered its flags. This man, who'd been a colonial officer, a rebel general, and a reluctant president, had become this symbol of everything the country aspired to be. His former aide Henry Lee gave this eulogy that described him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And that's how people remembered him. But here's the complicated part that we have to talk about. Washington owned slaves, hundreds of them over his lifetime. Mount Vernon was operated by enslaved labor. And while he apparently grew increasingly uncomfortable with slavery as he got older, he didn't do much about it while he was alive. He didn't free his slaves until he died, and even then, his will only freed his own slaves, not Martha's dour slaves, after Martha died. He was part of a system that brutally oppressed people, and no amount of military or political achievement changes that fundamental moral failing. It's possible to recognize his importance to American history while also acknowledging that he was complicit in one of history's greatest evils. That's the reality. His legacy is this weird mix of the mythological and the real. The mythology version is this perfect marble statue, this flawless founding father who could never tell a lie and threw a coin across the Potomac. That version is boring and not even true. The real Washington was more interesting. He was ambitious and sometimes vain. He made mistakes. He could be petty. He owned human beings as property. But he also had this incredible sense of duty. He genuinely seemed to care more about the country's future than his own power or comfort. He gave up power twice when he could have held on to it. He set precedents that shaped American democracy. He wasn't perfect, but at critical moments, he made choices that put the nation above himself. What makes Washington's story remarkable isn't that he was some kind of superhuman figure. It's that he was a real person with flaws and doubts who nonetheless rose to the moment when history needed him. He didn't want to be a general. He didn't want to be president. But he did it anyway because he felt it was his duty. And in doing it, he helped create something new in the world. A republic that actually worked, a democracy that didn't immediately collapse into tyranny or chaos. At least not right away. The precedents he set still matter. The idea that military leaders answer to civilian authority. The idea that presidents should serve limited terms and then step aside. The idea that the office is bigger than the person holding it. These weren't inevitable. They happened because Washington made specific choices at specific moments. A different person in that position could have made different choices, and America would be a very different place. So yeah, George Washington was America's first president, but he was also something more than that. He was the person who proved that the American experiment could actually work. He took these radical ideas about self-government and republicanism and helped turn them into something real and lasting. Not perfect, not without serious flaws and contradictions, but real. And that, more than any military victory or political decision, is why he's still remembered as one of the most important figures in American history. He wasn't just there at the beginning. He helped determine what kind of beginning it would be. And that mattered then,